It's the week ending Saturday, the 13th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen two former Prime Ministers criticise the UK government over universal credit, Brett Kavanaugh being confirmed as the new Supreme Court Justice, and the Tour de France trophy stolen in Birmingham. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Holden, Frith and Cameron Tait. And starting the show this week is Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
What happens when I say shampoo and you say hair wash liquid?
We designed it so that a simple scan of an unfamiliar South Korean word with a smartphone would translate it into North Korean. Translating several words all at once is also possible. It was hoped that with this app, the North Korean defectors would be able to get proper education. We of course plan to continue to help them adjust well to life in South Korea.
That was a promotional video for an app called, imaginatively, the South Korean North Korean Translator. They're really working their SEO there. Rebecca, up until literally I just heard that clip, I was under the misapprehension, clearly, that there was just one language for all of the Korean peninsula, Korean.
Yes, and certainly both sides would say that they speak Korean, but some estimates have said that now only 70% of the language is mutually intelligible on both sides of the border, which makes sense when you think about it because they've been separated for about 70 years, and obviously North Korea, not the most open, transparent society, hasn't been developing new words really over that time compared to South Korean, which has imported lots of English words and other foreign words, which has kind of widened the gap between the two.
And as our resident university-educated linguist on the show, you were the person who brought singing in Cornish to our attention. Can you flag up some examples of North Korean and or South Korean that the other side might find confusing or entertaining?
Well, a lot of it is, as I say, foreign and imported words. For instance, South Korea calls ice cream, ice cream. Mm-hmm. It calls shampoo, shampoo. But, with an accent. But obviously I won't do the accent for obvious reasons.
Please. But basically because they've been open to the West,
yeah,
right?
And North Korea, traditionally, although there is some reports that this is starting to change because they are starting to get more access to outside media, secretively now, tends to just put together existing Korean words for those things. And that kind of came to international notice in February during the Winter Olympics when North and South Korea fielded a joint women's hockey team. And apparently they found it very difficult when training together because there's a move called a T-push, which is, I'm not an expert on hockey, and the South Koreans would just call it that. It's just the international English expression. And the North Koreans had like this 5-word phrase for the same thing. And this apparently they had to issue a glossary to help both sides understand one another.
Okay, but do you think, Holden, that this is important really in terms of unification, though? I mean, I can see that it's a bit of an obstacle, but I mean, you could argue that England and Scotland have, it wouldn't be as much as 30%, but probably 10% of words that we have.
The UK and the US.
Different variants on, yeah.
I think in a way it's a microcosm of the broader conflict because both sides' stated aim is reunification. They just have a very different idea of what that process would be and what the end result would look like. There's the sort of philosophical question of whether it makes it harder to think the same if you don't have access to the same vocabulary. And it does feel as if it's not just a case of the South Korean language moving in a more westernized direction. That actually, on the northern side of the border, there has actually been a deliberate attempt to nativize Korean and to remove Chinese influence, which before English was the biggest influence on the Korean language. Also, it seems that the language and the alphabet is much more important to Koreans than the Roman alphabet, to bring my contractually obliged mention of the Romans into the podcast early.
Holden's doing the classics, Rebecca's doing the language. Cameron, you're going to bring motoring into this somehow in a minute.
Well, yes.
Yeah, sure.
It is a slightly foreign idea to us because our alphabet is foreign, but both North and South Korea have national alphabet days because there was a moment in 1446 when the king of Korea, King Sejong, created the Korean alphabet. Before then, Korea had used Chinese. And this led apparently to a much broader access to literacy because the Korean alphabet was much simpler, more intuitive, easier to learn. And so national identity is tied up with language, and particularly to the alphabet, to a far greater extent there than here.
And that's actually the reason that it's been in the news this week, is that on Hangul Day, which is the day when South Koreans celebrate the national alphabet, the Prime Minister of South Korea announced that he wanted to try and get the North to work together to create a unified Korean dictionary, which was a project that was started in 2005 but kind of just sort of petered out because of the other diplomatic ups and downs in the relationship between the two Koreas.
I mean, Cameron, I was being facetious when I said you're going to bring motoring into this, but actually, you know, technology and motoring is your beat, and so much tech comes out of South Korea, doesn't it? Samsung notably, that does highlight, actually, you know, Rebecca hinted at this too, the consumerist-facing South Korea versus the completely isolated North Korea. The language is the least of the problems, isn't it?
Yeah, this is something that really interests me, actually, because obviously if you think of over the past 20 years, there are so many terms that have probably been coined in the West and that have been picked up by South Korea, because South Korea's progression in the tech sector has just been insanely fast, particularly over the last decade. So I'm interested to see what terms they would have for smartphone computer, because North Korea only launched its first iPad rival, which you can only get in North Korea, last year. So
when you say iPad rival, I mean iPads aren't available. I presume.
Giving them a fair. Well, if you, I guess,
no,
if you took it out,
choice.
I guess if you took it out of North Korea, then it would be comparable.
But there isn't a Pyongyang Apple store, as far as I know.
No. It's the only tablet that you could get. But do they have a word for tablet? So I'm wondering if you do combine the two dictionaries, obviously there's a lot of English terms that South Korea has adopted. And it's not just South Korea. A lot of Asian countries do a similar thing as well. Instead of just creating a new word in their own language, it's just adopt the English. And I wonder how that will translate over to the North, because obviously there's a lot of national pride in the North. Will adopting English terms, especially if they tried phasing out Chinese terms, will adopting English terms go down well with them?
And actually, this is, in a weird sort of way, a technology story, because it's about an app. The clip that Rebecca played for us is about a translation app. If your goal is trying to unify people through language, is educating them through an app the best way to do it, do you think?
I can see that working for the South, but I can't really see it working particularly well for the North, because they only really have one tablet. I'm sure there will be some smartphones, but because it's such a secretive nation, I don't hear about the smartphones that come out in the North.
I think there's also obvious huge amount of hostility to anything that isn't North Korean, and that's become embedded in the language debate too. Kim Jong-un's grandfather referred to the South Korean version of the language as a mongrel tongue that was firmly rooted in the rotten feudal bourgeois life and full of the type of nasal twangs favoured by women to flirt with men. So he clearly wasn't a fan of the 30% of new vocabulary that had entered the language.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing, is that, as Holden was kind of hinting at earlier, there is a huge kind of cultural attachment to the language, which is going to make this more of a minefield, I think, than we would imagine. I mean, South Korea probably not going to take kindly to any more of that kind of rhetoric. They do actually have there's actually a society in South Korea that exists to promote using the Korean alphabet for languages that don't have their own alphabet. So they found this place in Indonesia that had just an oral language, and they bombarded them with textbooks and set them up in this little project where they would use Korean characters. Yeah. And this isn't, some crackpot person's, one-man society. This actually has like a lot of backing and recognition in the country. So it is a lot more, I think, fraught than we would imagine.
And people do get very attached to the idiosyncrasies of their particular language. And, even in the UK, there are big regional differences in dialects and pronunciations. And there was a Twitter thread that went viral this week in which Nick Kapoor was describing the work of a BBC committee in the 1920s when they were trying to standardise pronunciations because, radio was the first time that a lot of people were hearing words spoken nationally. And this committee started by ruling on how you pronounced garage and canine, which apparently before then was often pronounced canine.
No.
But apparently so.
I've never. It's like you never ever hear someone say potato, do you, despite what the song claims?
But it's interesting that garage is still, you can say garage, you can say garage, you can say... Garage. There's sort of three distinct varieties there, but canine has just become canine. There's no alternative. But anyway, this committee got slightly carried away with its successes and started to try to create new words. Some of those caught on. So roundabout replaced what had previously been called a gyratory circus.
No, you're blowing my mind.
But then some of them didn't. So they really wanted TV viewers to be called optivisors or visiors. And sadly, that didn't take off.
Great new name for Gogglebox, though, isn't it? Visiors.
But what's interesting is it's not just simply creating new words for ones that may not have existed before. It also carries over to concepts too. Apparently the North doesn't have a tax system, whereas the South does, so there's no word for tax. So if you do create one, it's like, okay, well, what's tax then? It's like, well, okay, well, we hand this money to the government. And so you're not just throwing in new words that you can all use. It's new concepts as well at the same time.
This doesn't really have a precedent that I can think of because, I mean, if you think of East and West Germany, for example, they did basically speak the same language, didn't they?
Yes, there was the difference in vocabulary, and again, a lot of that was rooted in the political systems. But there was never the complete information shut-off around East Germany that there is around North Korea. I mean, the closest thing I can think of is it reminds me slightly of the way that Hebrew was reinvented as a modern language for the State of Israel. It's kind of a similar thing, really, because, I mean, Hebrew had existed throughout that time, but reinventing it as a everyday conversational language was able to bring together the new citizens from all different countries.
But hold on, are you suggesting that anything that radical could happen here? I mean, surely actually this is about homogenising North Korean, so it sounds like South Korean, isn't it? It's not about creating a whole new dialect.
No, but it's about kind of a linguistic rapprochement that could hopefully have political repercussions. And even if it doesn't, I think would be useful because, we hear a lot of stories about how North Korean defectors have an incredibly difficult time integrating into the South, obviously for lots of reasons, but one of them is the linguistic difference and also their dialect. A lot of North Korean defectors say they've been discriminated against in the South because of their accent.
Holden, you're next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Here's one more reason to kick the habit.
The tobacco industry demands the annual sacrifice of more than 600 million trees, making it responsible for 4% of global deforestation. Tobacco curing and marketing alone require 12% of the timber used worldwide. Packaging itself uses 4 miles of paper every hour, day and night.
That was a YouTube infomercial by the Be Puff Free channel. Holden, tobacco is bad. Who knew?
Yep, it's bad in another way, it turns out. This is an industry that's come in for criticism on many fronts, and including the ecological effect of the litter it produces, mainly from the cigarette butts, 5.6 trillion of which are produced each year. Many end up in the oceans and enter the food chain in the 10 years it takes them to decompose.
But what's the new
thing?
thing?
This week's report, which came from Imperial College London, focused on the other end of the industry, so the cultivation of tobacco itself, and really identified 3 problems with it. One is deforestation, particularly in the African and Asian countries where a lot of tobacco is produced. These are areas where malnutrition and food security are often an issue, and yet vast tracts of land are being turned over to growing tobacco instead of food. Second issue is carbon. The industry generates 84 million tonnes of carbon a year, which is twice as much as the whole of Wales generates. And the final issue is water use. Tobacco farms use 22 billion tonnes of water a year, which means that somebody smoking 20 cigarettes a day throughout their adult life would be responsible for the consumption of 1.4 million litres of water.
Okay. I mean, some of those statistics sound bad, but I mean, more carbon than Wales. I mean, so what? Is that a surprise? I mean, more people smoke than there are people in Wales, so that's not that surprising, is it? I mean, what do we learn from this?
I think that's a good point, and a lot.
I mean, smoking is still popular.
Smoking is still popular. Food is also still popular, and food requires a huge amount of water to be produced too. So really, my reason for bringing this story in is the suggestion that we should be pricing in the environmental cost of not just cigarettes, but all levels of consumption, as well as just the kind of material costs of production.
Cameron?
Yes, I completely agree, especially on, if people are charged more for smoking. And the reason I'm a little bit passionate about this topic, not because I'm not the biggest fan of smoking, but obviously, I don't know if people have realised, I quite like cars. And they're obviously known for their carbon emissions, and the way that the industry is going about it is to tax and or completely remove cars that emit too many emissions. But it doesn't seem like anything's done on the cigarette front. While we don't, Britain itself doesn't actually contribute a lot to the production of cigarettes, we are a significant importer. So why don't we kind of ramp up import taxes on them?
I mean, well, the answer to that is cigarette smokers have suffered enough, right? That's what they'd say. You know, they're now paying whatever it is, £8, £9, £10 a packet. I don't know. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. But it's becoming completely unaffordable. It's a vice. They know it's bad for them. They know they've got an increased chance of cancer. You know, they know that by buying it, they're contributing more tax. They know all that. Is it fair to ask them to pay more because, you know, their choice is having an environmental impact? Or wouldn't it be fairer to say the multinational corporations should be paying more towards offsetting that, not passing it on to the consumer?
The question of how you would implement a kind of broader programme of environmental cost setting and reparations, I think, is a really good one. And there are carbon offsetting schemes for flights, for example. So if you a return flight to New York, you can pay an extra roughly £50 and trees will be planted that, in theory at least, will clear your carbon debt from that particular flight. But there's two ways you could look at this sort of environmental pricing. One is that it's sort of reparations. It's money that you use to then undo the damage. And then the other is incentivizing cleaner alternatives. That doesn't really work for cigarettes because I don't think, well, maybe you could say vaping would be I'm not sure if there's been an environmental study on the consequence of vaping. But in general, if you look at something like the 5p plastic bag tax, the idea is not really to raise money to undo the damage, it's to try to get people to stop using single-use plastic bags.
Another 5p on a cigarette is not going to get noticed, is it? In the West. But then that's another point, isn't it, Rebecca? If cigarette consumption is growing, which I read in this report it is, which astonished me, that's not here, is it? It's not in the UK, clearly. More people are vaping, more people are giving up smoking. That is probably in developing countries.
Yeah, there's a huge divide between the developed world where smoking rates are dropping and the developing world where in some parts of the world they are continuing to grow.
So, when Holden says, these developing countries that are deforesting their nations to make way for cigarettes rather than food, those are the countries that are smoking it. It's not Britain, it's not America that's smoking those cigarettes, is it? It is the developing world.
No, exactly. But the thing is, it's not as though the people of those countries necessarily have a fair choice. It's not so different from the opium fields of Afghanistan. If foreign buyers are willing to pay you a lot of money, then you don't really have a lot of choice compared to growing food to feed yourself, but it's not going to earn any income.
As you say, Olly, cigarettes here are really expensive, but in a lot of the developing world, they are very cheap. And China is where most of the growth in cigarette consumption is happening, and their taxes on cigarettes are very low. So I think the economic pressure could be brought to bear to the same extent in those markets where there's growth as they are here, and that would probably stifle a lot of that growth.
And this isn't unfairly targeting cigarette smokers, really, because if you look around, these days we do exert an enormous amount of pressure on consumers to make more ethical choices. I mean, obviously, as Holden was saying, it's not as clear-cut what the alternatives would be to cigarette smoking, apart from maybe vaping. But, we do now pressure people to think about buying fair trade goods, to, not buy the eggs from caged hens and all these things. So I think ethical
the price structure is
the
unethical ones are cheaper still. So actually, you're not pressuring people in their pocket, are you? They're making an ethical choice to spend more.
No, but I think, that's true. But I think that, again, is because there isn't really an alternative to cigarettes. You just kind of have to stop people from doing it full stop. But in a way, I do feel like this is a kind of problem that may solve itself over time, surely, because, there are only a limited number of countries in the world. The developing countries are eventually going to get to a stage where the tide turns, presumably, and people do start becoming more health conscious and, turn against smoking. And
China is having a shift towards a more environmentally friendly approach now. So while they've had these years of kind of mass expansion, they've kind of gone, okay, we are actually putting out quite a lot of harmful gases into the atmosphere. Let's do something about it. So we may find perhaps a change in approach with China slightly later down the line. So it could happen.
The best advert for an environmental aspect to pricing is actually the UK energy market, where for the last decade or so there has been carbon pricing built in. I mean, it's a tax essentially, but it's built into the price of fossil fuels. And that has moved us from a situation just 8 years ago where 74% of our energy was produced from fossil fuels, 60% of it from coal, to now where only 41% comes from fossil fuels and just 2% from coal. Britain's overall carbon emissions are now lower than they have been since 1890. And we're almost at a position where wind and solar energy can compete on a purely economic level playing field without any subsidies. But in order to get there and to encourage that development, we've needed a situation which sort of penalises fossil fuels by imposing this carbon price.
Because the issue is that unlike lots of other, ethical choices, and unlike with the energy market, there isn't really a way, fundamentally it comes down to there isn't really a way to continue to smoke and still feel good about your ethical choices, because they're just, there isn't a way to ethically produce trillions of cigarettes every year.
The thing is, though, a lot of people from a lot of different social classes in this country smoke. Even though it's very expensive, it is still just about an affordable vice for the working man, isn't it? It is the thing of you finish your shift in the factory and you can afford to have a fag, and that's your release from the world. And there are a lot of choices that richer people make that are unaffected by these kinds of carbon taxes. Like Holden was saying, if you fly on a plane, that's voluntary, whereas this tax would be imposed on everybody, including the poorest people who are using it as their vice.
Well, yeah, but in the Victorian times, the working man had to save up to buy his opium, and the rich man was walking around with opium coming out of his ears.
Aren't held up as the bastion of
exactly.
equality,
We've moved on from the days when you could consume narcotics, whether you were rich or poor anyway. The tide turned against that as a health risk.
No.
And
You're flipping what I'm saying.
I'm not.
What I'm saying is rich people get to do whatever they want, whereas your ordinary sort of bloke in the street would be penalised by this.
And that's true with the energy price question too, because the result of the shift in the source of energy has meant that prices have risen, because the poorer you are, the higher a proportion of your salary you end up spending on energy. That has disproportionately affected people on lower incomes. The same would be the case if you adopted a similar sort of ethically driven price on food, because the cheapest food tends to be mass produced, tends to have lower welfare standards.
And speaking of food, should we be doing the same for meat? We hear a lot about how vast swathes of the Amazon are being used to grow fodder for cattle to feed our relentless beef-eating frenzy.
Yeah, but you see, there again, the people who get the posh steak from Waitrose, they can afford the extra £5. People who go to McDonald's for a family meal once a week can't.
It's an irrefutable argument, and I don't think there's an answer to the claim that rich people always have a broader range of choices. I think the way you could counter that would be to say that, in all likelihood, the consequences of climate change will also be brought to bear more severely on poorer people and rich people. And so it's just another way in which, unfortunately, the costs will have to be paid by somebody, and it's probably the poorest who are going to feel it the most.
OK, time for carbon-emitting Cameron and his cars of fun. What is your story for this week?
Are women about to take pole position?
There have only been 2 women in 68 years of World Championship Formula 1 racing out of 900-odd drivers who have entered Formula 1. The difference is not one of capability, but one of opportunity.
Motor racing is an expensive sport. You need the funding, and women are not getting that funding, so they're not getting that opportunity. So they're not developing their skills, they don't have the experience. Many of them spend half their time trying to fundraise rather than out there on the track getting the race time they need to be able to develop.
Louisa Dearlove ending that explainer video for the new W Series. OK, so Cameron, first of all, what is the W Series?
So the W Series is a single-seater, one-make racing series that will be fielding just female racing drivers. And it's the first of its kind.
That's extraordinary in itself, isn't it, that there isn't a women's racing league?
Well, it is, and it isn't. The reason it's quite extraordinary is that it really is amazing that there aren't many female racing drivers. There is a handful compared to the hundreds and hundreds that you'll find in Formula 4, Formula 3 and all the GT-style championships. But then again, racing has always been a mixed sport. There has never been a mass female racing series before. So
and the theory behind that is like with horse riding, right? So it's about the machine as well as the driver. So there's no reason theoretically why a woman can't compete equally with a man.
Exactly, yeah.
So is it sexism then that has prevented women from rising through the ranks thus far?
Well, that's the hot topic.
I know, that's why I asked.
Yeah. And it's the one that's majorly debated. I think, in a word, yes. A lot of people argue that women haven't really cut it against male racing drivers, and that's very hard to track because when you start racing, you can start as young as 5 years old in karts, and a lot of those aren't really tracked until you get to the regional or world championships. So you can never really kind of see how a young girl performs against younger boys. So a lot of people say that it's that women so far haven't displayed the same kind of racer instinct as men. But a lot of other people argue, and I'd be among them, that they haven't been given the support because racing is still kind of relatively run by the old guard, and they kind of see the boys being the faster ones and the girls aren't worth it.
Yeah, so the kind of extraordinary thing about that, Rebecca, he says, talking over the woman, is that I sort of imagine, perhaps for the wrong reasons, I mean, perhaps people would sort of sexualise women in Formula One, but for whatever commercial reason, there is a commercial imperative, just like there was having a mixed race racing driver in Lewis Hamilton, to have a female race. I mean, actually, having a woman Formula One champion, I would imagine, would bring loads more viewers. You'd think Formula One would want to do it, even if that woman was objectified.
Yeah, I think there's definitely reason to believe that would be the case. I mean, and after all, we've seen, it's hard to tell because it's been 4 decades since a woman raced in Formula One. But, we've seen definitely interest in female jockeys in the major horse races. That's definitely become a thing. And when Sabina Schmitz joined the lineup of the new Top Gear, that certainly drew a lot of attention as well, the idea of having a female driver in the lineup. So I think there is definitely an appetite for it. But like Cam was saying, a lot of it is the fact that it is seen as a boys' club. I think it was Bernie Ecclestone who famously said that women should be dressed in white like other kitchen appliances. When that's, the face of the sport, that's not very encouraging to young women who are maybe interested in getting into it.
So I suppose what this comes down to then is it a good idea to support an exclusively female racing series like the W Series, or is it a better idea to put pressure on Formula One to encourage more women drivers to come forward into the major ranks?
I mean, obviously, I would say both. But at the same time, there are some female racing drivers who've come forward and said they find this idea quite patronising and as though women are being sort of funneled into their little handbag league away from all the major action. But at the same time, I think there's only so much you can do by breaking down barriers and prejudice within Formula One is part of it. But if there isn't the early years nurturing support system in place to get those female drivers from a young age and sort of bring them up through the ranks, then I think breaking down sexism at the top level isn't necessarily going to have a huge amount of effect.
Holden.
It does seem like this could be a way of accelerating that process.
Pun intended.
Of getting women into a position where they can compete on an equal footing. But it does remind me a bit of the argument we've just been having about energy production, and that in order to get to a position where renewables were on a economic level pegging with coal and gas, there had to be a sort of a market intervention in order to accelerate that process. And I think it just feels that if you can put female drivers in a position where they can develop their skills, get more exposure, get more marketing money behind them, they will then be in a better position to get onto the F1 grid and get a drive there.
Unless, Cameron, people sort of talk about it like they do about women's football or women's tennis. Like, it's a good game, isn't it? But it's not as good as the men. I prefer watching the men. I mean, that's the danger of this, isn't it? You see the women and the female champion of the W Series still wouldn't quite cut it at Formula One. That could be terrible.
That's what I fear, that people will look at it that way. I've kind of been running over so many scenarios in my head of how this could be successful and how someone who enters a W Series would be then plucked and put into something like European Formula 3, which is a couple of ladders below Formula 1. You'd have to have someone dominate that grid, I think, for people to kind of go, okay, maybe she's the real deal. We'll put her up against the rest of the competition. And then I think if you had great races where people are constantly battling for the lead, they'll go, oh, it's really good for women's racing, but would they be, could they cut it against men? For me, I think there was an idea that I really liked that was put forward by a chap called Tiff Needell. He did used to race in Formula One and used to be a presenter on Top Gear before the major revamp in the early 2000s. So he said that it would be a good idea to do something like a junior racing program. So I believe other sports series do this, of where you kind of find talent at a very young age and you nurture them, you put money into their career and you help them kind of every step until they get into the major racing series, such as Formula One. Wouldn't it be better to put the money that's going towards the W Series towards a select group of female drivers when they're, say, 8 or 9, help them through karting, which is an extremely expensive series to get through, and kind of make sure that they are the best of the best when they enter Formula One, so people have got a proper challenger on their hands.
Is there an element of discomfort amongst the Formula One viewers as well? Either that they see it as a sort of masculine, machismo-charged environment and they just don't want women on the screen racing as well, or actually just that kind of bizarrely sexist, protective feeling people have about women. You get this when you have this discussion about women on the front line in the army as well, of I wouldn't want to see a woman in a car crash for my entertainment, but when it's a bloke, it's fine.
No, I mean, I'm a huge racing fan, so I keep up to date with a lot of it, and there is a real want to get women into racing, and there isn't that kind of, I mean, it's so safe that if they were involved in a crash, there's a very high chance that they'd be absolutely fine if they came out. People want to see it, but I think because there's been such a phobia of it, people have been uneasy about kind of women in racing over the past 10 years. No one's really been nurtured to get them ready for Formula One at this point. So while the attitude's changed, and I think people are really ready to get female racing driver into Formula One, the talent, even the ones that are kind of 17, 18, they've not really been helped through the younger part of their career, and arguably they're, dare I say, too old to be kind of nurtured now.
I'm sorry to keep returning to the commercial thing, but I do think the sponsorship opportunity would be amazing as well, Rebecca, don't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think,
if you're, Nike or whatever, having a female racing driver, that's just damn cool, isn't it? I just don't understand.
The adverts would be superb. Yeah. I mean, thinking about the potential for, exciting ads. But I think, as Cam was saying, it's quite a recent change that people are now starting to say, no, actually, we do want to see some female drivers. Where are they all? And it turns out, they're not there because we've only just decided that we want them. And, it is the kind of, as Cam was saying, it's an expensive and very time-consuming career to train for. So
I did want to touch on the commercial thing as well, actually, because I think if we'd gone back, let's say, 15 years, then you may have been able to push a woman into Formula One and kind of gone, look, it's a woman in Formula One, isn't that a big deal? Even if she finished last, she may get a few years out of the career. But now things are different. People don't want just a woman in Formula One. They want a competitor, someone who's going to be really good. We actually had someone called Carmen Jorda. She was climbing the ranks through the younger series, arguably on her looks. She was very slow. She used to finish last in most races, and she was given a Formula One test role. She was given everything and didn't quite make the cut into Formula One because she was just simply too slow. So the body that runs Formula One, the FIA, actually appointed her as the head of the Women in Motorsport Commission, and she came out and said that women should try and aim to go in slower racing series because they're less physically demanding.
The argument about physically demanding or not and safe or not, I think is an interesting one, but it's sort of disproved by the equestrian sports you're talking about in the Olympics. That is the one Olympic sport where men and women compete on equal footing, and yet it's probably amongst the most dangerous of the sports in terms of deaths over the years. And I think a lot of people feel genuinely protective, like it isn't. It's maybe an element of sexism, but it's not a desire to keep.
But it's a bit weird.
It is, and it also. But I think a lot of the division between men and women in sport actually comes out of a different anxiety, which is more of a sort of Victorian prudishness of like you don't want people of different genders mixing and socialising and sort of being active together because who knows what might happen. And I think possibly the reason that both motorsport and horse sports have allowed it is because you're separated either by the metal of a car or by the kind of flesh of a beast that isn't human. And that creates a kind of safety zone around the all too sexual beings of
Rebecca, you're just
athletes.
laughing at the phrase the flesh of a beast that isn't human.
That's how I always refer to them. It's my North Korean heritage coming out.
Well, on that bombshell, as Clarkson would say, that is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Cameron Tait, Holden Frith and Rebecca Gillie. The flesh and blood. Tell us how wrong we are about any subject you disagree with us upon. We are at Week Unwrapped on Twitter. And whether you agree or disagree with us, if you enjoy listening to the show, please do write us a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps other like-minded people discover the show. Please hit subscribe to get us every week. If you haven't done that before, just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Thanks again to our sponsor, Barclays Corporate Banking. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.